So I think we can get going so we can, be judicious about everybody's time. But I wanted to wish you all a warm welcome. Thanks for coming to join us at the Democracy Dialogues. For some of you might know me, some of you we might be meeting for the first time, but I'm Victoria Couquetz. It's great to have you with us. The team and I have programmed an important discussion to engage with all of you. As you know, we try to be timely, we try to be responsive, and we want to connect with everyone who's advancing democracy across Canada. So feel free to get in touch. So today, I hope you'll actively participate. I really look forward to your questions, your comments, your reactions, everything you bring to this conversation. But first, I'm looking for your introductions, please. So I'd love to have all of you introduce yourselves to me and to one another. So I'm hoping you can use the chat function and you can let us know who you are, where you're joining from, and what organizations you belong to. So today we're here to talk about how we make municipal elections fun and meaningful, which is a bit of a tall feat given the cultural climate. But what we do know is that there are 3 municipal elections going on in our country this month. In my home here in Toronto, where the Exchange is located, advanced voting has started and election day is October 24th. In BC, this Saturday, October 15th, and Manitoba on October 26th. But I guess my question is, how many of us will actually turn out to vote? And for how many people is this at the top of their radars? The past municipal election in Toronto had a vote turnout of approximately 40%. So that's less than half of us deciding on who will create policies around our day-to-day lives for 100% of us. That's a lot of power for most of us to be giving up. So I want to ask you guys a couple poll questions before we get into our conversation to gauge what you're thinking and feeling. So Ashley is going to help me put up those poll questions. So the first one is, do you think cities make municipal policy issues well known to the public? So hoping you can all weigh in. It's looking like 100% of us are saying no, which is pretty unanimous. And then the second question we have for you, Ashley, if you can throw that one up when you're ready. Thank you. Sorry, we'll give Ash a second. There we go. Yep. Upon reflection, are you participating in civic life to a greater extent than in 2019? And by what we mean by that is pre-pandemic. Okay, so a little bit more variability here. So a bit of a split vote. So some people are saying yes, about 45% of us, about 27% are saying no, and actually it's fluctuating. So we're split across the board. So thanks very much for that. I think that gives us a little bit of scene setting. So as you know, we've invited some deep thinkers and some dedicated doers who are creating pathways towards increased engagement, and I'm really excited to welcome them in a moment. But first, I'd like to offer a land acknowledgement. So today we're meeting virtually. You may not be on the same ground as me. I'm currently in Toronto, which is the traditional territory of many nations, including the Anishinaabe, Haudenosaunee, Huron-Wendat, and Mississaugas of the New Credit Territory. So instead, please join me acknowledging the Indigenous peoples of all the lands that we're on today and to reflect on their importance. We have to continuously work hard to understand the long histories of these lands and recognize what those histories mean for the work of truth and reconciliation ahead of our shared work around democratic engagement in our communities and the ecosystem we're all operating in. So I encourage everyone to take the time to learn about the lands you call home and to think about what you're doing personally to advance reconciliation in Canada. Here at the Exchange, we're committing to understanding and taking up our collective role in reducing harm and advancing reconciliation. Before we get going, I'd also like to acknowledge that October is NDEAM, or National Disability Employment Awareness Month. And with so many opportunities to work in the upcoming municipal elections, I encourage all of us to apply and spread the word, as well as make meaningful employment opportunities for everyone according to the full spectrum of abilities. So Ashley's actually going to share the job link page in the chat. So if you or anyone you know would like to apply to work in the municipal elections, I'm quite sure they need as many as they can get. So thanks very much for that. Now I'm very excited to welcome our guests. They're arguably the coolest ones we've ever had. So with that, I'd like to welcome Andrea Reimer and Dave Meslin. Both Andrea and Dave are dedicated community activists. They've been successful by doing things differently, thinking outside of the box and engaging people from all walks of life. And I think they're 2 great examples of people who are having fun and spreading that fun in their communities. So welcome, Dave and Andrea. How are you?
I'm great. Thanks so much for inviting me. I can't wait.
Thanks, Victoria. I am feeling a lot of pressure now to be cool today, so it probably isn't going to happen, but that's okay.
I don't think you have to try.
It's going to happen. It's going to happen.
It's totally going to happen. Okay, so, let's get to it. Let's do some climate setting. So what we know is that here in Ontario, 139 mayors and reeves are claimed, and 35 municipalities aren't holding elections. But this isn't just an Ontario issue. We're seeing this across BC and Manitoba. So before we kind of get into solutions, I want to explore some of these issues. So Dave, can you help us make sense of what's going on? How did we get into this mess of lower participation in local politics when it impacts our daily lives the most?
I mean, I could flip that around and say that I think it's a miracle that anyone's voting based on the way the system is set up. There are so many clear, concrete, and valid reasons why ordinary people aren't participating. And I have a lot of empathy for them. And I really think it's important to diagnose errors, flaws in the system, rather than trying to just, cheerlead to the public and say, hey, you should be voting. So municipal elections in Ontario, little different than Vancouver. There's no political parties here in any municipalities in Ontario. And it really makes a big difference because in a provincial or federal election here, the parties play a huge role. They're the ones who nominate the candidates. They're the ones who do all the fundraising. They do the graphic design. They develop the platforms. You remove that out of the electoral process and you're left with this huge vacuum. And I'm not in any way suggesting we should introduce political parties municipally in Ontario, but we need to take account for the fact that that the tasks that the political parties would otherwise be playing, no one else is doing it. And one very simple example is nominations. So again, in a provincial or federal election, the NDP, the Greens, the Liberals, the Conservatives, they'll go out there for a whole year before the election and try and find candidates because they need to put a name on the ballot. And ideally, they want it to be a good one. Municipally, nominations open here, used to be in January. They've changed it all the way to May, which is, I think, another obstacle, but whatever. And how would anyone know? Like, it's literally kind of this insider secret. And so what you end up with is the children of former politicians, and by children, I mean sons, not daughters, the sons of politicians, because their dads are like, hey, Mike, you can nominate now, it's open. Go be like your papa. Or you get political staffers. So if you take Toronto City Council and remove all the people who are literally the biological hereditary sons of former councillors and remove all the people who are former executive assistants of former councillors, there's hardly anyone left. And I think it doesn't surprise me at all because from the first day of the process, which is nominations opening, the city staff don't feel that it's their role to actually promote the fact that there's an election happening. So I think it's a miracle that anyone votes. I really do.
Thanks for that, Dave. And there's a lot of truth in that. Andrea, this isn't a new story. Participating in municipal elections have been low for decades. Do you think there's something different going on now, or do you think it's more of the same? And to what extent are you seeing people invested?
Yeah, well, I think we're in the most boring election in Vancouver's history, which is weird because we have more people running for mayor than we usually do, like serious contenders. We always have a lot of people on the ballot. But yeah, I mean, I think you have to sort of contextualize it in a broader democratic picture. So Ontario's recent provincial election, by far the lowest voter turnout in history in Ontario, Newfoundland, Labrador, Nova Scotia, British Columbia. So all of the elections that we've seen since the pandemic started have been substantially lower. And you could chalk some of that up to people being nervous about going in person, but I think by the time the Ontario election happened, that was not so much of a concern. So I think the sort of highlight is that people have not just unplugged from each other, but unplugged from the institutions that kept them safe, actually. Or, I mean, you're in Ontario, so maybe didn't keep them safe during the pandemic, but I mean, these institutions that they were previously plugged into. Municipal elections, I mean, as Dave mentioned, even with parties, well, we have a problem here now of too many parties. Like they might as well be all individuals. There's a lot of vanity projects on the ballot this time, and that just makes it, if you're not personally attracted to a candidate in some way, shape, or form, like the cult of personality, then it's hard to discern what's different between one party versus another, which hasn't been the issue here. But yeah, I guess summary highlight, it's new, but it's not new municipal. It's just new that people are, well, new, part of a trend that has really accelerated with the pandemic and is quite concerning.
Thank you for that. And Dave, I know so much of your book, Teardown, really gets into a lot of the reasons why there's so, I don't really sheds light on the nature of intentional exclusion. And I want to talk about that a little bit. But I think we should actually talk about some of the positive work that you're doing in the community of Grey Highlands first, because, you know, we're talking about traditional disengagement, but you're really turning that on its head and doing something very different. So hopefully you can tell us a little bit about a hopeful narrative of positive civic engagement.
Yeah, every time I complain about a problem, I also try and show what the alternative is, either by finding a place that's already doing it or by just doing it myself. So the thing I was just complaining about moments ago, that municipalities in Ontario literally make no effort to promote the fact that nominations are open, which is kind of one of the most important parts of the whole process. So I created this group up here in Grey Highlands. You can check out the website, votegrey.ca. And we announced publicly that nominations were open and we actively recruited candidates. We went out there, like I was actually walking up to random people and I was like, hey, I'm Dave. Have you ever thought about being mayor? And I did this for weeks. So the same way you might scout for a baseball team or scout for a record label, I was just scouting for council. But we also designed this flyer. It's a full color flyer. And we designed it as not a bureaucratic like nomination period is open, but we designed it based on what it is, which is the city's hiring 11 people. And it says what the salary is, it says what the job description is, and then knowing that people will be a little shy, it says, are you council curious? Get in touch with us. We printed thousands of these and mailed them to every single household in the municipality. And then we held information events where people who were council curious showed up and they could fill out a little card at the end and you could check 3 boxes. One was, put me on your newsletter. One was, I want to volunteer. And one was, I think I might want to run. And then I would follow up with those people with the coffee and be like, okay, what are your concerns? What are your hesitations? And while Ontario is facing this avalanche of acclamations and municipalities where there's no elections at all because no one's running, in Grey Highlands, we ended up with the most candidates ever in the history of our municipality. More candidates than any municipality surrounding us in the county. Our first female candidate for mayor ever, which is a sad threshold that we haven't passed, it yet, but we do have our first ever female candidate for mayor. And again, in contrast to what's happening across the province. And like, this isn't rocket science. If people know that there's an opportunity to run, and it's presented to them in a way that is colorful and simple in plain language, and it's presented as an opportunity rather than just some like weird, random, abstract political mechanism, like what's a nomination period. If you present opportunities like that, people will step up, and we've proven it here in Grey Highlands.
Congratulations. And I think one of the many things I find amazing about that is also that you were doing it given that you were a newcomer to the community. And do you think that it was really because you were kind of the bearer of good news and opportunities and presented, like turning these usually quite dull processes on their head and really engaging people and seeing their potential? Or how did you, what were your reflections on that, given that you were a newcomer?
Most people up here seem to be relative newcomers to some degree. Okay. Like there's been a big influx of folks up here from Toronto, definitely in the last 3 years during COVID, but even over the last 10, 20 years. So it's not unusual for someone to be up here with the 416 phone number that they still have from back home. But I put together an amazing team of people who've been here for a long time, newcomers. But what made it work is that we created this fun group. So it's called the Municipal League. So again, in the absence of parties, who picks up that slack? Well, we do it now. It's the Grey Highlands Municipal League. It's a nonpartisan civics group that just tries to act as a bridge to make it easier to get involved. And then we did the flyer. Notice the exclamation marks too. Municipal clerks will never use exclamation marks. And we have them all over the place. It's a very helpful tool. But we also hosted the events at like fun places. So we had an event that was it was outdoors on a patio of a cafe. And I spoke as one of the main speakers, as the cheerleader, like, you should run, you should run. But to her credit, our municipal clerk, Raylene Martel, she showed up as the other keynote speaker. And she was there on behalf of the municipality, answering questions that I'm just there as a cheerleader. But if someone really wants to know, okay, I want to run, I have a question about this or that, she was able to answer it. So it was a really fun combination of a legitimate organization working with the municipality, but also doing it in a really fun way in outdoor patios with exclamation marks.
Exclamation marks are awesome. And what I really like about that too is kind of meeting people where they're at. So often people have to, really labor to get that technical information to understand what the rules are. But the fact that the city clerk actually saw the value in meeting community where it was at, like that's pretty stunning. Andrea, I really want to ask you about your experience as a counselor and fun in politics, which Dave is making a normal thing, and so have you. But I think that's something that people usually associate with one another. When you ran and you served on city council, was it fun? And how did you make it so?
Well, the human brain is wired to remember the crappy parts of life. And this makes sense, right? Like if you think about our biology and our long arc of biology over history, preserving your body is about monitoring threats and remembering threats, right? So when I saw that question, I was like, oh God. And yet, like when I really took another minute to go down, it was a lot of fun. And that may seem irreverent somehow to not, and I think that's sort of the first lesson, is that there's serious topics, but you can't take yourself so seriously that there's not room for other people to participate, right? And I think that's a Twitter, social media generally has created a self-gaze for politicians that has made them take themselves perhaps too seriously to leave room for other people. And I think that's a key lesson. So, election campaigns, because of the energy and the focus of election campaigns, you can have a lot of fun in election campaigns. I actually, I decided I did 4 terms in office and decided that was probably enough for me, for sure. I think maybe for most people that's enough. And I miss knocking on doors because during elections, like normally going onto private property, people are kind of nervous about that when you're walking up to their door, right, and knocking on it. During an election, they not only don't mind, they kind of get annoyed if candidates aren't coming to their door to talk to them, right? They may also get annoyed when you come, but they're happy that you at least are taking this effort, right? So, and I think that ultimately fun is about, it's about context. So there's certain kinds of fun you probably wouldn't have in the middle of a city council meeting, but that are totally appropriate during an election campaign. And so that means you have to understand context. And to understand context, you've got to get out of City Hall and go out into the community. And I think increasingly, again, the pandemic has created some challenges for that, but it can be metaphorical as much as it's concrete, right? Like, how are you making space for the community? How many times did I hear staff say, well, we held more meetings, Councillor Reimer, but still no one came. And I'm like, yes, because the meetings were at City Hall. Like, you've got to go out into the community and meet people where they're at. So in one single night, when I was elected, this was admittedly one night in 10 years, but I was in one night at a Squamish language karaoke event. Squamish is one of our First Nations on whose unceded territory Vancouver is. I was at a Vietnamese karaoke after that and ended the night at a Chinese karaoke. So, if you're not, and I'm not a singer, so if you're willing to make fun of yourself and get up on stage and do the things that other people are doing, that helps create the room for them to wonder a little bit about what you're about and why you're so into this thing called municipal politics. We've spent a lot of time also, I mean, you do need people to come to City Hall at some point. So one of the big efforts I put in was around, you know, if the first time you come to City Hall is when something is so bad in your neighborhood that you've overcome, you know, fears that you bring from other contexts that you've been in, new immigrants, Indigenous people, and you've overcome that fear to come to City Hall, it's unlikely to be a good interaction for you or City Hall, right? So like, how do you demystify it and make it a safe space? So we did a yarn bombing thing at City Hall. We would do celebrations, festivals. We had a Black History Month celebration, a Pride kickoff. The challenge on all that stuff is that sustaining that level of fun is really tough. So then it just becomes around, once you've done all these big events, when people do show up, are you still making room for them? Or are you inviting them into your metaphorical Victorian parlor where they're expected to act in a certain way that is totally out of whack with whatever culture they have coming into it? And I think that's the discussion. And Dave's been so good at this, right? Like really bashing down that fourth wall of not just making people excited about getting to City Hall, but making them excited about the fact that they went, right? Rather than making that the least fun part of it.
You know, you raise an important part of, I think a lot of this can be well summed up with, we need to have like a work hard, play hard mentality, right? And not all the hard work is actually done in an office. It's actually done through bonding, through, this is actually how we start to understand our, you know, collective, like what we want to see collectively in policy and what's important to us. And that can't always be done around, you know, in a very formal process or around a boardroom table, no matter what sector you're working in. But Dave, I want to ask you about some fun things you've done too, because I've heard that you managed to make electoral reform fun through Lego. So what should we be doing to make municipal elections more fun? And why is fun important in all this?
I'm looking for a little prop I had. I had these little horses. Where are my horses? Oh, well. I make it fun primarily for myself. Advocacy is really hard work, right? When you're campaigning for any type of reform or change, you inevitably will experience 10 failures before you experience a success. So why not have fun along the way? But it also is, it's a great outreach tool to take an issue or a topic and just make it more colorful, make it more tangible. So I'll just give you a few examples. I will find those horses. This is breaking my heart. So these are my Lego blocks I use to create rainbow visualizations of our election results all across Canada. I have a page, it's called Lego My Vote. It's at unlockedemocracy.ca. And after each election, I think I missed a few along the way, but I try to do every federal and provincial election. I show what people actually voted for and then the seats that they got, and show how our voting system in Canada really distorts voter intent, and we don't really get the result that we voted for. You can use pie charts, you can use, you know, there's lots of other ways, but Lego is more fun. And I remember I was on the CBC once on election night, and they were going to have me on to talk about voting systems and how first past the post distorts the results. And I asked them, can I bring Lego? And their response was, well, that's kind of weird. We have like really expensive and fancy like 3D holograms. Why would you use Lego? And I said, trust me, Lego is the way. And sure enough, the most watched video clip from CBC that night, in fact, their most watched political video clip of the entire year, was me and Ian Hannamansing in front of my towers of Lego, like millions of views. People loved it because we had Lego and we had this fun tension between me and him because he doesn't support voting reform. So he was kind of being the defender of the status quo. But people loved the Lego because it's fun, because it's Lego. And I'll give you a few more examples. I use beer coasters for a lot of my materials. Instead of just printing a flyer or a business card, I'll give people a beer coaster or a milk coaster or juice coaster, whatever you want. You don't have to be into booze. And People like it. It's more fun. It makes me seem more down to earth and approachable. They also last a lot longer. So if you put a leaflet on a politician's desk, it's in the recycling box by the next day. I've gone back into journalists' offices, like editors or counselors or MPs, and it's still on their coffee table like a year later because it's a beer coaster. And then here's another beer coaster from another campaign. Not only is it a beer coaster, but it's a really fun, cute, furry animal logo. And I don't know what's going on in BC, but in Ontario, all the cell phone companies use like furry animals to promote cell phones. It has nothing to do with cell phones. It's always
right?
like a dog or a whatever. So why can't we use furry animals to promote our ideas too? So this is called the Ranked Ballot Initiative of Toronto. The acronym is RABBIT, and our logo is a rabbit. And it's all fun, it's all playful. So my aesthetic, whatever I'm doing, to the best that I can, is to show that I am angry about the status quo. I'm upset about the slowness of basic reforms that we should have done decades ago. But I'm not just that angry guy yelling at a protest who doesn't know how to have fun. Because if we want to bring more people into the movement, I think it's important not to project an angry vibe, because people have really stressful lives. They're stressed out at work, they're stressed out from their family. They're not going to start volunteering for a group that is also wrapped up in anger and stress. So it's a tough balance, because you also don't want to sugarcoat how big the problems are, whether it's racial equity, economic inequity, climate change. Like, these aren't laughing matters. But that doesn't mean that the process towards change can't be framed within a playful aesthetic.
And I think that's a really important way to redirect anger, right? Because at the end of the day, as you said, times are heavy. I think democracy is dwindling in many ways. The climate, I don't even know what to say about the climate, but these are really big things, and people are feeling exhausted and resentful and angry especially after the pandemic. But I think you are providing a really positive example of how to channel that anger. And that's really going back to your community and doing something about it. So if you're going to be angry, can you remain active? Can you not kind of isolate and just kind of deep dive into that hole of despair, but can you get out there and start actually co-creating the society you want to live in? Yeah, it's a tall order, but there are some people who are doing it. And I also think it's important about the idea of doing things differently. I think people's eyes are glazing over when they see more of the same over and over and over, and that's a point of disengagement as well. But speaking of that, Andrea, I want to ask you a little bit, because I think in many ways you're a unique profile of a politician and not more of the same, and someone that people were obviously excited about and continue to be. So when we think of who looks like or sounds like a politician, we often think about lawyers or business people or people who cut their teeth in student government. And you're not one of those cliches. You are a terrific and unique example of something else. So I'm just wondering if you can tell us a bit about your story and how you decided that running for city council was the best way to create the changes you wanted to see.
Yeah, well, it's a good question. I mean, I'm thinking about all these poor candidates up on stages right now, having to give their origin story in like 1.5 minutes or less. And like nobody's story really works that way. So I'm going to shorten it down a bit for you. There is more to it. You're welcome to email, tweet, whatever me if you're interested in more information. Essentially, I was a foster kid, adopted, not an uncommon story in that, although also not inevitable. Left home quite young and lived on the streets for a number of years. In that was, very politically, very angry to Dave's point, right? So marching, petitioning. I think it was a point in history in the sort of early to late 80s where austerity measures, Margaret Thatcher, Mulroney, like there was a lot to be angry about. And I was so excited about being able to vote for the first time, because to me, it just seemed obvious that instead of getting crappy people to try and be better at doing the things we wanted them to do, we could just get good people in there. And then, I mean, I've learned a lot more since then, but it just seemed like an obvious thing to me. What blew me away and continues to, and it really has been a great motivator for me, was that nobody I was marching with or going to endless evening meetings with or standing on street corners with to get petitions or any of that, or standing in food bank lineups or any of these things, none of them saw voting as a viable way to make change. And this was 35 years ago now, right? And I don't know, something in me was just like, I have to believe that this is a pathway. I mean, I voted in my first election. Me and 300 other people voted for someone I was absolutely sure was going to win because she was like me. She was young. She had experience of living in poverty. She really cared about these issues. This was a time when you couldn't just Google it. You had to go to different campaign offices and get the information. And it just gave me a passion for trying to figure out, how do we make room for people that don't look like these people that you're talking about? It's not that I don't think those people can do good things for people like me, but consider this. I mean, I posed this to a white, university educated property owning male politician one time, because he's like, well, you can set up advisory groups for that. And I think advisory groups are great and important, and set up a lot of them in my time. But I said, look, if everyone looked like me on city council and I set up an advisory group of people that look like you, how well represented would you feel? And the answer was, maybe not so much, right? So these people who are used to having power don't, I mean, they're looking here. They don't see all of us like just trying to get by, just trying to pay rent, just trying to figure out how to deal with 20% higher food costs, right? Whatever that is. And so, I took my skills at leafleting and going to evening meetings and rallying and moved them into political activism. And eventually, if you hang around long enough, someone's like, I recruited a lot of people to run for office. And finally, someone's like, well, why aren't you running? And there you go. The rest is kind of history. It may not seem like it today because here I am, talking up a storm. I never liked the cameras. I'm not a microphone person. Like, I much prefer what I would consider the hard but fun work of meeting people where they're at, like going to events, seeing, not to talk to them about my issues or even for them to talk to me about their issues, but just to understand what matters to them by seeing it played out in front of me, right? So that, I think, brought a very different perspective to city council, I would say.
And what about when you kind of evolved from, or continued your journey from activist to politician? Did you find that, did your tactics change from going from an outsider to kind of being an insider, or did you feel like, there was some continuity there, or what was your experience?
Oh, I mean, it was definitely tough. The first time I was elected, I was the only Green Party person elected in the country, the first. So that it was me.
Congratulations.
And at a time when the Green Party was still, and maybe this is still a time for them, where they were pretty ambivalent about the idea of being elected. I mean, we were running in elections, but for other reasons, right? To raise issues, to push other parties. And so I wouldn't say I had a lot of support from them. I mean, they weren't actively hostile, but they just didn't know how to support an elected official. And so school board, for those that don't know, here, and I think also in Ontario and Manitoba, is very much a part-time position. You need to do something else. So I was running an advocacy organization all day. We just had this landslide conservative win provincially. So we were fighting 77 out of 79 MLAs who were totally opposed to what we were trying to do. So I'd do that all day, and then I'd catch a bus and run up to school board and sit in a chair all night where people were lobbying and advocating to me. What I learned from that, I was not a very good activist. I learned that the people who sounded like me were not very effective at what they were doing. And I think it was the single most important threshold I've crossed as an activist, and really learning that a good activism is about relationships. And if you come into it angry, mad, I mean, those are reasonable feelings in light of the many things that are going on. And it's okay to go and be angry with elected officials, but not if you also then want to work with them to do something. So that's the room that I learned how to create. But definitely on council. So the very early on when I was on city council, we struck up this thing called the Greenest City Action Team to develop a policy around how we could get to be the greenest city in the world. We had our first meeting, and I come out of activism, so I go home and I set up a Twitter. That in the meeting, I'm like, how do you want to stay in touch? This is like 2009. They're like, well, Twitter would be great, like to let people know what we're doing, and let's set up a Facebook group. So I go home and I do that as a city councilor. And just as I'm going to sleep at like 1 a.m, I send a note on email to a few city staff, being like city manager, communications, being like, just FYI. So I wake up the next morning to like a lot of text and phone calls that I missed because they've been calling me since 6 a.m, being like, you have to take this down. So it turns out it's the first ever social media accounts the city had. Like, it hadn't even occurred to me they wouldn't have them. And it's not what councilors do, right? It's just outside the structure. So, that was my very first learning, that it just like you have to meet the community where they're at, learning how to meet staff where they're at and bring them to where you're at takes some work, right? So I had to learn a lot of skills that I wouldn't say I had in activism, but maintain the push to be an activist government.
Yeah, and I think that's just shared experience, and it's powerful that you're talking about navigating that and learning that as an insider. Dave, I'd really like to bring you into the conversation, expand that a little bit. As we all know, and if you guys haven't read Tear Down Democracy, you absolutely should. And even if you've read Tear Down Democracy, you should also listen to the audiobook, because getting to hear it in Dave's voice, like I did this week when I listened to it, is really cool. But Dave, you really do a great job of unpacking the mechanics of exclusion and how difficult it is to navigate these public spaces, and that otherwise caring citizens are disengaged through intentional exclusion. So can you help explain that a little bit to our community that's here today?
Yeah, sure. So I use this analogy in the book about how, like, a multi-billion-dollar sewage system in a metropolis, if it breaks down, it's because of the tiniest things that got in the way, like dental floss and baby wipes. Like, for some reason, they can't figure out how to not prevent dental floss from clogging up these sewage systems. And likewise, when we look at what's wrong with democracy and what's holding us back, I think it's often the littlest details that might seem minor. They might seem like a piece of dental floss, but cumulatively, it creates a huge problem. So what I do in a kind of playful way in the book is I, kind of tongue-in-cheek, contrast the way government talks to us with how businesses talk to us. And of course, I do this in my TED Talk, where I compare a Nike ad to what a municipal notice would look like, or what a Nike ad would look like if it was designed by a municipal clerk. But there's lots of other examples, and I have a really exciting thing to share with you. Not only did we send out the call for nominated candidates back in the spring, but now that we know who the candidates are, and I don't know of any other municipality doing this anywhere in Canada, we designed and printed and delivered a full color candidate menu. Every candidate, photo, a little blurb, and then learn more at our website. On the back, we've got events, so all the upcoming candidates debates and the school board things, blah, blah, blah. And a little paragraph reminding people what local governments actually do. Because one problem that I'm sure Andrea is aware of is that people really underestimate the importance of municipal government. We're taught in schools that provincial and federal is like that's where the real important stuff happens. And municipal is almost like junior leagues, where you just run there hoping that you'll go to a higher level. It's almost universally accepted now that municipal government impacts our daily lives much more than provincial or federal. There's even this idea that if the federal government shut down tomorrow out of the blue, like, we wouldn't even notice for weeks. And if the provincial government shut down, we might not know for, let's say, a few days. And if the municipality shut down, you would know right away, because the things we interact with every hour are regulated and run and funded by City Hall. So yeah, we made this. Again, we printed thousands of copies. We sent them to every household. And I did this based on a very simple idea that I got from Canadian Tire and Home Hardware, who also send me full color catalogs every week, letting you know what's on
Mhm.
sale. So what clerks are doing now, mostly in Ontario, is sending out black and white cards that have either your PIN number if it's online voting or a list of where you can vote, and then it just says vote. And that would be like Canadian Tire sending you a postcard that says buy, and the address and their hours, and that's it. Which so it's once you see what it should look like. I mean, of course, every election and every election administrator should send out a full color catalog of what the options are on the ballot, especially when you don't have political parties doing all that fundraising and promotion. So this has been really fun. But the other cool thing we did is as soon as nominations closed, we held an event within 2 days where you could meet all the candidates. It wasn't a debate. It wasn't an all candidates meeting. It was, an outdoor patio with booze and cookies and pizza. And they each got 30 seconds just to say, this is my name. Now you can put a face to a name. They had name tags. So there's 3 running for mayor, 3 for deputy, 17 for councillor, and about 9 for trustee. And it was just a chance to just see who they are and then hang out for a few hours and talk to them if you wanted to. And again, it's a way of just making it just a little more accessible and fun than just coming out to a all candidates meeting in a community center with fluorescent lighting and a bad sound system.
And can feel very intimidating, right? Because if you've never been to one before, you may not know how to act or what the protocol is, but I think everybody knows how to go to a happy hour or party, right? And I think, it's incredible because it's simple, but it's revolutionary. Like the fact that there isn't a one-stop shop or a one-stop kind of flyer or handout that actually lists all the stuff in an accessible way in one place, I think really speaks to that intentional exclusion. I was actually at an event last night that I'm going to ask you both about in a moment, but one of my friends who's highly engaged, she was a civic action, diversity fellow with me. She, it's, at the front lines of civic engagement, but she said to me, I've been trying to look for who all the candidates are, and I actually can't find them. And when I do find them, I can't find what they're all about. And I just thought to myself, wow, if she is struggling, and I know she's not alone because there are a number of us who are kind of commiserating around it, can't find that stuff. Then what about people who are just trying to tap in for the first time or have experienced lower levels of engagement? So,
but not even that. It's not enough to make the information available. Canadian Tire has a website. If you want to find out what's on sale, you can go to their website. That's not enough for them. They're like, no. We got to get this in Victoria.
Into your hands.
We will spend money and resources. Even in this digital age, we have to get full color printed paper in Victoria's house. It's so important.
Victoria would like that.
Yeah. So if Canadian, it's not rocket science, and every other sector is already doing this. Everyone is treating us with a kind of respect. They're competing for our attention, our dollars, and they're sending us really well designed pop-up ads, banner ads, print ads, you name it. And government is just dropping the ball. Well
said. So I went to a Strong Mayors panel last night. And this is, of course, reaching to the Strong Mayors legislation that the province is putting forward. And it was interesting because it was 5 of Toronto's former mayors, Sewell, Crombie, Eggleton, David Miller, and Barbara Hall. And it was a pretty amazing thing. A, I did not know that there were still 5 living mayors, which is a pretty extraordinary thing. But B, we don't always find consensus around so many politicians. But, this is a serious topic, and they all felt very strongly that this was a danger to our local democracy and an overreach from the province. So, Dave, what do you think of the Strong Mayors legislation? And Andrea, I know you're not from BC, but I want to turn to you afterwards and ask you if you think that more generally, if mayors should wield greater power. So Dave, do you want to?
She is from BC, not from Ontario.
Oh, yeah. Sorry, I meant to say BC. Sorry about that.
I hate to say it, but this is very much in line with the trend we've seen over the last 20, 30 years. So municipal democracy in Toronto has been eroded and eroded and eroded in so many ways. One of the best examples being the forced amalgamation in 1997. 6 municipalities each had referendums about whether they wanted to amalgamate with each other, and all 6 strongly voted no. And Mike Harris at the time who was elected under first past the post with a majority government that most Ontarians never voted for, most voters never voted for. He did it anyways. In my book, I trace the history of amalgamations. Each of those cities had already been amalgamated, or at least most of them. Toronto had been amalgamated multiple times. Every time you amalgamate, you take a city hall that has public hearings on budgets and has, a mayor and council and staff, and we've shut them down. I think we've shut down a total of like 13 city halls in the history of Toronto. We also used to have elections every year. People don't know this. For most of Toronto's history, it was annual elections, which is probably a little too much. And then they went to 2 years, then they went to 3 years, then they went to 4 years. And then the number of councillors was cut in half just a few years ago, again, by an undemocratically elected, in my opinion, premier who doesn't have a real mandate from the province. So there's so many ways that the system is being designed in a way that really does feel like it's rigged against ordinary people. And in terms of election design, I have a long laundry list of basic things they could do to make elections more accessible. The first being stop holding it on a weekday when everyone's at work. You would never hold a Super Bowl on a Monday, or a Grey Cup on the Monday, or a Pride Parade on a Monday. Why are we holding our municipal elections in Ontario on a Monday? It's so stupid. And there's tons of examples like that. So the reason why it's been so bad in Toronto to reduce the number of councillors is because two things. One is similar to how you want to keep classrooms small so a teacher can give attention to all the students. If you're a city councillor for 150,000 people in your ward, there's just no way that you can give them adequate attention. But more importantly, the cost of running an election campaign across a ward now in Toronto is the equivalent of running for mayor or MP anywhere else in Canada. And again, with no party backing you up. There's no institution fundraising for you. So if you want to run for councillor in Toronto, you kind of have to be a really well-connected person or connected to people with deep pockets. That's a problem. So now on top of all that to say, oh, and by the way, the mayor can now just overrule city council and just veto them, which in my book, I have this graph where I chart out the last 800 years, how we went from a very pointy shape of power where the king is on a throne at the top and all power is in the hands of one person, and how over the last 800 years, we've actually devolved the other way. Over 800 years, we've gone up and then back down. So we went through this period where we replaced kings with councils and parliaments and senates and legislatures, because one person shouldn't have all the power. It should be a body of people, a house of common people. And over the last, let's say, 100 years, we've drastically gone back to the model we had 800 years ago in so many ways, concentrating power in the executive branch, which is the mayor, the premier, the prime minister's office, through party whips, through vetoes, et cetera, et cetera. So to me, it's not surprising at all that now we're essentially seeing city councils neutered and we're putting the mayor in charge, because we all know that in our provincial legislatures and our federal legislatures, there's only one person in charge, and it's the premier and the prime minister.
Thanks, Dave. And Andrea, I know that you're keen to jump in on this as well, and then we're going to go to questions.
I do, and I'm going to give, this may not sound surprising coming from a former city councillor, the opinion on this, but I mean it more as someone who has spent 35 years from the streets to city council trying to fight for room for people. So Victoria, you said it earlier, cities matter a lot, right? Dave, you said it as well, 50% of climate emissions, more than 50% directly in the scope of a local government, 65% of direct services. I could go on, but cities have very little power to make the changes they need to effectively meet those challenges. So it's sort of like being a city councillor or mayor, being in the backseat of a car that's being driven by the province. But critical thing here, the province is blindfolded while it's driving this, right? So you're all trying to shout up like, we need this, got to do that. If you gave only one person in the backseat the power to yell loudly towards the front, would that make the situation any safer? No. The thing to do here is to take the blindfold, get the provincial person out of the front seat and get strong cities so that they have the powers and the taxation authorities that they need to be able to take action. And the only way you're going to convince the public to make cities strong is if they've got distributed power that people feel like they can access. So the strong mayor system like just completely torpedoes any chance we have of having viable 21st century frameworks for cities to work for people that live in them.
I totally agree. I wish someone would make an initiative called Strong Citizens, and actually instead of strengthening mayors and solidifying power, that we, continue to teach people about the importance of being strong citizens. So I want to get to the questions from the audience. We have a couple of really thoughtful ones coming in, but I also want to plant that I want to ask you both in a fire round before, like a very quick round, what you would say, but what is the antidote to apathy or complacency? So that I'm planting that seed, but in the meantime, Dave, this question's come in from you, from Kitty's. So the candidate menu is a really great idea. Is there a cost on how much it would cost for each municipality to send these out to every household? Maybe you can would you mind sharing the numbers on what it cost in Grey Highlands?
Absolutely. So it's called unaddressed bulk mail, and it's actually really affordable. You don't have to like pay for a stamp for each one because there's no address on it. So the postal carrier just fills his or her bag with your flyer and puts it in every box, and it's very cheap, which is why Canadian Tire and Home Hardware can spend money doing it every week. Our stated goal with the Grey Highlands League is to see if we can increase voter turnout by 50% with a budget of $1 per voter, which in Grey Highlands is just $10,000, so that's why it's a great place for us to experiment here. There's 10,000 residents here. In Toronto, it would cost $3 million. And I think that would be $3 million really well spent. And that's for our whole campaign. It wouldn't be $3 million just to do mail out. I'm not sure what the numbers would be, but essentially printing is very cheap when it's in bulk. And then you would just be paying for citywide, it's called neighborhood mail. But any candidate can also do this. It's called neighborhood mail. Canada Post offers it. It's very cool, very cheap, very fun.
Okay, awesome. Thank you. And then the second question comes in from Samira. What steps can municipalities take to make local elections more enticing for voters? So instead of waiting every few years instead of waiting every few years again to say voter turnout is low and try and incentivize people during election season. So Andrea, what do you think about that one?
Yeah, I mean, it's pretty straightforward. People vote because they have a reason to vote, right? So, I mean, all the things we've talked about, they're not inspired by Mike, Rob, John, like the sons of the previous politicians or whatever, right? They're not inspired by they don't know what cities do. And even if they do know, they know the provinces have all the power. So they're just going to show up at the province or a lot of the power. So really like, the idea of being inspiring is so important, right? So we're talking about fun, but the things that are most fun are the things that are inspiring while they're fun, right? Like it's not slapstick, which is like this sort of like contextless fun. You actually need to engage people on something they're already passionate and interested in, right? Which is often themselves, which is totally fine, right? So go meet, don't call renters wacky, like get on the ground if you don't yourself rent and get more engaged with renters. I do think the advisory committee system is important, not to replace having a diversity of voices in government, but to create the pipeline of those voices coming into government and these positive messengers out into communities, right? So each of those advisory committee members goes out and talks to 10 friends who might talk to 10 friends, and that's going to engage people more over the long term. I think the flyers are good, but they need to connect. Like, so if my friend Dave told me about this amazing advisory committee that had this impact on this issue I'm inspired about, and I get a flyer, I'm going to go vote, right? So it's like how all of these things work together.
Thank you. And so we've got one more important question, and it's hard because, it's such a compelling conversation. We're running out of time, but, we touched on the need for greater representation earlier, but Sarah's asking, what are your thoughts about Bill 5, Stopping Harassment and Abuse by Local Leaders Act 2022? Any advice to candidates who experience harassment and racism, which I think is a huge piece as to why people are feeling disincentivized? So wondering if maybe we can try and answer it quickly, but then maybe point to where people can take that next. I'm not sure who would like to take that one.
Yeah, go
I
ahead.
can speak a bit from my own experience. I mean, I still, like 4 years after leaving office, have a couple stalkers I have to worry about. So it goes like for people to know, like there's the harassment, but there's a finer point on it. And all of this is to tell you that it matters that onlookers intervene, right? So in any kind of bullying situation, there's the bully and there's the victim. Neither one of them is that able to change the dynamic. And in fact, the victim trying to intervene can often supercharge the bullying because it's looking for attention, right? So what you really need is all those people who are watching this and doing nothing about it to intervene in effective ways. And effective ways look like calling out, but calling in, depending on the severity of it, but also drawing zero tolerance lines. If you're moderating,
Absolutely.
if you're at an event, like stand up and say something, regardless of your affiliation with the person. You don't have to like their party or their politics to believe that they deserve to have a safe space to talk about their politics.
Thank you, Andrea.
I'll just add something there. I mean, any sector or workplace environment has to deal with this issue. In politics, I think it's particularly worse because you're so out there as a public person, whether you're a candidate or you're elected. I have a whole chapter in my book called Bloodsport about how we've designed our political spaces to be adversarial and for politicians to actually fight each other. Forget about getting harassed by the public. Like politicians are harassing each other in council chambers, in legislatures. And the system doesn't have to be designed that way. It's actually like built into the DNA. We literally call the second party in the legislature the opposition. Like it's their job to just oppose. Whatever you want, Victoria, we're against it. That's our job. It doesn't have to be designed that way. It could be more collaborative. And lastly, I just want to say this really ties back to the voting systems we use. First past the post in particular encourages and rewards negative campaigning. And if the three of us were running against each other for mayor on a ranked ballot, I want to make sure that if Andrea or Victoria drops off on the second ballot, that your supporters put me second, which means I can't spend the whole campaign attacking you. I need your supporters to not hate me.
That's an important one.
There's a lot of system design reforms we could implement to boost civility and change the whole tone of politics. It doesn't have to be a kind of militaristic landscape where there's one side here, and they're just fighting all the time.
Amazing, thank you. And so I think, I wanted to end with like, what is the cure to apathy? But I actually think we've explored it in this conversation. And I actually want to turn the last few minutes over to John Beebe. And I just want to say thank you to both of you. That was extraordinary. And I think we totally had fun and gave different ways to envision how we do this. And I really want to say thank you to our community who joined us along the way. And, John is also going to say thank you and goodbyes and a few calls to action.
Thank you, Victoria. That was definitely one of the most fun conversations we've had. Both of you, as Victoria said at the beginning, super cool guests and people who, can be hard-headed in the challenges we face, but inclusive and fun in the approach. And I think that is a very powerful combination that both of you embody. And so thrilled that you were able to join us for this conversation, and look forward to continuing that, because, I think we all feel sort of the malaise that is certainly surrounding municipal elections here in Ontario. Andrea had spoken earlier about sort of the lack of energy in Vancouver around the election. And this is a healthy reminder to us that there's ways to do things differently. And so again, thanks everybody for joining us here today, and the support that we get from Toronto Metropolitan University and the Faculty of Arts that make all of this work possible. But most importantly, from everyone who's part of this conversation, because we know that the real work happens in community, and through the leadership of regular folks who really just care a lot about their friends, their families, their neighbors, and want to do something about it and are willing to step up. So thank you. Stay in touch, and and yes, vote. Because personally, I find going to vote kind of fun, because I get to see interesting new people. Like it's like the act. I'd like to do it in person on election day, but there's not that much we get to do. And the truth is, and Andrea, I completely appreciated your point. Like when you first voted, it just felt cool. Like it felt like powerful, and it is. It's the one moment where all our power is equitable. Like they don't privilege one person's vote more than the other. Not a perfect system. Dave has spoken eloquently around that, but it's how we can bring about change. And Andrea, I still remain optimistic that yes, we can get counselors, we can get representatives who represent us and represent the communities where we work if we go out and participate. Because we're definitely not going to get them if we don't. So have a wonderful week, next couple of weeks. If you're involved in any of the municipal elections, go knock on doors, go volunteer for people you care about, who you support, and have some fun doing it. And then, hang out on a patio with friends and talk about, what your next plan is. I think that's clearly one of the key takeaways from today is gather on patios with beverages of your choice as part of any of this process. And I look forward to doing that with everyone here in the not so distant future. All right, so with that, we will see you at our next Democracy Dialogues, and we will be in touch.